I've seen the faithful hand of a God who's always known what people needed.
Yeah.
Whether they were a wealthy person in LA or whether they were a refugee who is living in the corner of Phoenix, every tribe and tongue, God is seeking them out and is inviting us to get involved.
Welcome, everybody. This is Simon Gilbo with Inspired. It's great to be back with you. We got another fantastic guest. Welcome, Joe Saxton.
Hi, thanks for having me.
It's great to have you. Joe and I go back just, I think, over 20 years.
Yeah.
When we first met, you were Joanna Yinaram.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you remember that time, but it was hilarious in retrospect. It wasn't funny at the time because I went up to preach in Sheffield. I think you were running St. Thomas Crooks, the young adults or youth work. And I arrived at the Roxy Cinema. I got there 2 hours early. And it turns out I've been given the wrong venue. And this is, I mean, you probably did have a website, but I was trying to track down anyone. I didn't know you. I didn't know where I was meant to be. And eventually, sort of 2 minutes before I was meant to speak, we managed to connect and I just about made it in time. So that was our first stressful meeting. But since then, you hosted us in LA when I did my cycling ride from San Diego, that we cycled from San Diego to Charleston. That was a 34-day adventure in which your husband, Chris, joined us for the first couple of days. And then he came out to Burundi and did the Burundi cycle ride. So we've had loads of stuff overlapping at conferences like New Wine over the years. And so that's just putting it in context. Now, Joe, for everybody that doesn't yet know her, she's an author, speaker, podcast host, leadership coach, was raised in England. We're going to talk about that, but now living in Minnesota in the US. So that's a bit of introduction. Now, listen, Joe, let's just crack on in there. So again, if you're new to Inspired, it's just about telling great stories, encouraging stories of faith. We're bombarded with bad news. There's so much bad stuff going on in the world, and it's really depressing to focus on that. And I think it's really just hit the spot in terms of so many people responding every week, sort of writing in saying, thank you. This is keeping me in there in the faith. So I'm excited to hear how, Joe, you're going to inspire us. No pressure. But go
Thanks
on.
for that, Simon. That's great. Thank you.
Go on. Take it away. Tell us about your childhood, first of all.
I grew up in, like you said, in London in the 80s and things. And I think in terms of, I was from a family which was broken in a number of ways. I mean, I don't know that it was unique to anybody else in the sense of lots of divorce and pain and all of those things. But I think I'm struck by when you said there about even transformation. When I think of the abiding thought of my childhood, it's actually how I met the Lord that really I'm always stunned by, because I became a Christian at the age of 9 years old. I was, my family, there are lots of religions in my family, great people, just lots of different, lots of faiths and stuff. So it wasn't automatic that I was going to follow Jesus. Put it that I guess that's my point.
Sure.
I wasn't raised with that expectation necessarily. But when I look back, what I'm stunned by is a casual conversation with another 9-year-old. Just a casual conversation saying, oh, my family are trying to make me go to church. And some kids saying, well, you should come to mine. And saying, we've got a kids club that happens on Monday nights. And them just telling me, just telling me about it, and me being so intrigued that I made my family take me.
Wow.
And I also remember, and again, I became Christian about 4 years ago, but I remember so clearly them talking about Jesus and the leaders talking about Jesus, but not just the leaders talking about Jesus, the kids talking about Jesus. And I remember just feeling, Simon, like I was missing out. Yeah. I was just like, hold on a second, who is this guy? And it's not that I'd never heard of Jesus before, but not like this, not like someone who you knew and could talk to. And I know that when we sometimes think of faith, we think of it in the context of adults and stuff, but actually here are these children with a genuine, active, living faith. I prayed today, God did this. I was worried about something, God did this, because kids have very significant interior lives, it's their parents who are divorcing, it's their parents who are alcoholics, it's their families that are going through hard times. There's so much said about that kids are resilient, that we forget that kids are actually affected. Do you know what I mean? They're actually impacted. But it was so wonderful to be in an environment where these kids knew him. And I remember going to the children's leaders and saying to them one day, because I was like, by that point, I was like, okay, I need to find out who this is. I need to find out what he's about. I was kind of desperate to know. And I got to a point after interrogating them one evening to say, okay, here's what you need to do. if you have one of those events where you unpack everything and tell everybody about who Jesus is and give them a chance to respond, I will bring a friend and we will become Christians that night.
Brilliant.
And they did, and we did.
Wow. And that was 9 years old.
I was 9 years old, yeah.
I'm trying to picture it, because I mean, a lot of the biggest churches in London now are Nigerian churches. It wasn't one of those, was it?
No, it was a small Methodist church. It was a very diverse congregation because it was an immigrant community.
Right.
It wasn't one of the big Nigerian churches. It was a small Methodist church in South London. And fascinatingly, the wider church was quite disaffected from the community, but the children's leaders had a massive passion and a massive burden for the kids of the neighborhood. And they had recently been filled with the Spirit. I can't remember how that happened. I think they'd gone to a John Wimber meeting or something like that. And so they said, this isn't even our lane as such, but we've encountered God and we can't stop now. Okay.
Are you still in touch with those guys in terms of, I always think it'd be so nice to sort of get in touch and encourage people, kids workers that don't necessarily see the fruit of their labor?
Yeah. The husband passed away while I was in uni. Mm-hmm. And I lost touch, I think, with they knew me as an adult. And so we lost touch by the time I'd reached my early 20s. I think would be the time. But it has, to what you said, it has given me, like, whenever I'm in a context with children's workers, I'm like, okay, let me just have a chat. We could be talking about anything. I said, I just need to sit and tell you a couple of things. Because like you say, so often when you're kind of leading or in ministry with a particular age group, you don't see the longevity. You sow the seed so faithfully and so sacrificially, and you don't know the amazing things you've done and the impact of the incredible things you've done. So it has given me a kind of zeal with children's workers and children's pastors. One of my friends runs a kids conference in the States. And so I often go there and say, okay, I just want to tell you what you've done. Do you know what I mean? I just want to tell you what God's done through you. Yeah. And the whole thing of do not be weary of well doing that we read in the Bible, I often think of children's leaders when I think of that.
Mm. Now, I'm thinking you grew up, it's quite a rough area, was it? Teenage stuff? I mean, were you just the shining light for Jesus amidst loads of drugs and gang shootings, or is that the wrong sort of caricature?
It was, it's funny, because I go back to that neighborhood now because my mum still lives there and it's been completely gentrified.
Right.
And so no one would believe what it was described as, but it was a forgotten, marginalized part of London at that time. So again, lots of different immigrant communities, which, as you will know, were not the most invested in communities because they lived in the areas they got to live in. Do you know what I mean? And they were allowed to live in. Yeah. And they weren't necessarily welcomed in. So there were lots of Nigerians, Jamaicans, Ghanaians, Irish community. Do you know what I mean? And we all lived in that. And as a community, we actually interacted quite well. It's just that collectively, it was a very deprived area. And so there was, amongst this group of kids, there were the children of dealers, the children of gangs, the children of drugs runners, but it was our normal. Do you know what I mean? That was the weird part of it. So I think for me, faith, I had this incredible encounter with the Lord as a 9-year-old in terms of meeting him and these leaders who invested with all they had and took our faith very seriously. And some might have called it too zealous, but I think they just got a glimpse of the world we were living in, whether it was our parents or whether it was just our friends' parents. Do you know what I mean? It's a very different play date. It's a very different meet up with your friends' families when those are the kind of families you're dealing with. And when you are pretty much generally as a community in a place of poverty. So they were like, okay, if we're going to take our faith seriously, the Bible is real, the Spirit is real, healing is real. You got praying for things straight away. Mm-hmm. And there were a couple of things that stood out before, like, teenagedom happened and puberty hit with a vengeance. I think what stands out to me in terms of our discipleship was there is something very treasured about giving people access to all that they know of the Lord. Do you know what I mean? There's something very powerful about saying, you're 10 years old, it's time to be filled with the Spirit. Do you know what I mean? And God's going to do stuff. But I think as well, the mission of God, because all of us were from quite eclectic families, what did it mean to be on mission for the Lord? What did it mean to be kingdom-minded? And one of the things these leaders did was they got us to sponsor these missionaries who were smuggling Bibles into parts of the world where you weren't allowed to have a Bible. Mm-hmm. And it was such a wonderfully subversive way of us having a kingdom mindset. And also it kind of formed you. It's part of your spiritual, I know people call it spiritual formation in a kind of really deep way now, but those were the things that formed us at that time. I think, but by the time we hit our teens, I mean, you know, you and I have teenagers, we know the deal, that it's just that there's so many voices calling your name.
Yeah.
There are so many pressures, and also you want to belong. You just want to belong. It's not that for me, it was never that I didn't believe in Jesus. It's just that he made life awkward. Do you know what I mean? Yes. I never stopped talking to the Lord. I never stopped believing in the Lord, but he was like this childhood friend that by the time I hit 14 was just embarrassing to bring around with me. And it just wasn't cool to say you went to church, and it wasn't cool to say you were a Christian, and it wasn't helpful. And I needed help, and it wasn't helpful. I'm like, Lord, it's not that I still went to church on Sundays. I still did all of those things. It was sad because the kind of boldness that we had, you know, that kind of carefree thing you have when you're a kid anyway, that kind of carefree nature, empowered by the Spirit of God, where someone said something and you didn't care if they're a stranger, like, I'm going to pray for that, all went. Disappeared for years.
So the obvious question is, when did that fire sort of come back ostensibly? But I don't want to miss any sort of key teenage memories, key defining moments that shaped you.
In some ways, it's a great question because the two collide. There were signposts and then there was a moment. So I think the signposts were the spring harvest, those kind of Christian events that you go on where you meet with the Lord and you're like, God, I'm going to live for you. And you have this injection of faith that drains out for the following year. Yeah. But it's still real. It's not that but it's just hard. It's not that it was superficial. And those were some really powerful moments. But you have those powerful moments and you go back to life, you know? But the key moment for me was I was 18 years old, and I'd said it, and that my 18th year, which in some ways seems like the oddest time to have the perfect time to have a revolution with God, and the oddest time because the temptations are even stronger because now they're legal. And now you're allowed. So on my 18th birthday, I said to the Lord, hey, I'm going to see how I can do without you for a while. And I literally, that was my prayer. And it was like, amen, kind of thing. And I just remember being so utterly bored, Simon.
Oh, really?
Utterly bored without the Lord. And so about 6 months later, by that point, I'd done my A-levels. I had a summer job. And I remember coming home to the kind of housing estate I lived in and seeing a sunset. I mean, I remember it clear as day. Honestly, I do. And I saw this neighborhood where, you know, friends of mine were now in prison. Good kids. I mean, I know that's a weird thing to say on one level for people, but I grew up with these kids. Do you know what I mean? They were my friends. They were not thugs, or, I mean, people did some bad things, but I knew them. I prayed with them. They prayed with me, and were now in prison or addicted to drugs or were alcoholics and just really suffering, really suffering, or hadn't kind of come under any kind of addiction, but were suffering from the struggle that was that neighborhood where people didn't give you a first chance, let alone a second, where you were written off because of where you were from and all of these things. And I remember thinking, as I looked to the sunset, humanity came up with that, and none of us deserve to live like this. None of us. Nobody of any ethnicity should be living like this. And I look at this sunset and I look and think, and God, and I remember saying, God, I don't know how you did it. I don't know whether it was 7 days or a million years. I actually don't care. I just know you spoke and that happened. And as I watched this sunset on the tower blocks, I thought, what am I doing? Do you know what I mean? I'm like, what? I think I even said out loud, I've backed the wrong horse. Do you know what I mean? You backed humanity where the best they could do is dehumanize entire groups of people and cast us off. Or God, who might have been uncalled, but somewhere in the midst of it loved us and created beauty and stunning sunsets that just took your breath away. And I said, I think I need to come back now. I think I need to come back. And it was literally the sunset seeing a sunset that did it. I mean, it's God's glory, isn't it? Uninterrupted glory that turned me around.
So, you were probably always a leader, whether leading people in the right way or leading them off the tracks, as it were. When was that leadership, on how did you get it positively channeled? What was the next step on that?
I think I went to Bible college after that, and I think it was in that year. I don't know. I think looking back, I realized I was probably the last person who to say I was a leader. But I think it was at Bible college. I was so grateful, first of all, for some of the leaders there who just because I I turned up a mess. I turned up a mess, and there were all these kids who had done all these mission trips, and I was, I mean, my language was in the basement, and I was. Do you know what I mean? I was kind of rugged and raw, and I had this sunset vision. Well, not vision, but sunset, and I'm like, and had this powerful encounter from my childhood 10 years before, but had just a lot of baggage by then.
Which Bible college was it?
Cliff College.
Okay, right.
Cliff College in Derbyshire.
Yeah.
And because it was a Methodist one, and I'd grown up in a Methodist church, and I was so grateful for these leaders who just are like, okay. Do you know what I mean? Some of the staff evangelists in particular who would be going out on these trips telling people about Jesus, and it just got my attention. It just got my attention. And part of back in the day, in the 90s, when you went to the college, you'd go on a few mission trips a year and you'd do study the rest of the time. And I was just kind of having my entire world turned upside down. And it's not like I could say there was one particular encounter. Like sometimes you have a kind of one-on-one encounter with the Lord. I felt that entire year was a one-on-one encounter with the Lord, really, by just being in environments where in some way, Simon, it reconnected me to the God I met when I was 9. And I think what happened was, one of the evangelists said to me, he goes, "I'm leading a mission trip and I want you to be my assistant leader." And I kind of thought he was talking to somebody else. And I'm like, "I'm sorry, what now?" And he said, "I want you to be my assistant leader." And I'm the youngest of everybody on the team. And he's like, "Yeah, I think it should be you." And I said, I said, "You can see me, right?" You know what I mean? You can see me. And he said, "Yeah, I think you should do it." And he just gave me a couple of guidelines, and he just was there. And again, it's that sense, there are some times where, for me, what was transformative was someone who was very much the hands and feet of Jesus for me.
Yeah.
And there was another person on staff there who was a Londoner like me, who'd grown up in environments like I had. And she had this laugh that just sounded like freedom. I can't put it any other way. And I just thought, your personhood, your personality does not match your story. And I said, you are free. You're not bitter. You're not cynical. You're not jaded. You've suffered racism in the way I have. You've been brutalized and all these kinds of things. And here you are. And we both know the only difference is Jesus. The only difference is Jesus.
Beautiful.
And seeing that combination of the two of those leaders, seeing this woman who was just this living embodiment of freedom, and then having this like quiet vote of confidence from someone who really had no business putting me in that kind of position, those things, like they were transformative people. There are lessons that they taught me 30 years ago that I still carry. Things from their life, just the testimony of a free person. It's just like seeing freedom is just one of the most dramatic, powerful living testimonies for me. Because I've seen bondage. Again, I've seen bondage in a community. I've seen bondage in people's lives. I've seen bondage in my own heart. And to see freedom walk in front of you day in, day out. And for maybe people who'd grown up in pretty stable environments, that seemed normal. But I thought, I know what this is. I know where she's been. I know what this is. I know only God can do that. And it was mind-blowing. It really was.
Beautiful. And I'm guessing when you have someone call out in you as a young person that you've got the potential to do something beyond what you think you can. Now, I presume you've called that out in so many people over the years because it's been modeled to you to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think to have people look at, you grow up in spaces, and again, this isn't about particular individuals, but you grow up in neighborhoods where you're not given the resources. I remember people would talk about an achievement gap, and it wasn't an achievement gap, it was an opportunity gap, it was an access gap to resources, and I think sometimes that has struck me about one of those natural things that's true in the spiritual as well. They saw me, they saw what God saw, and they didn't stop, they didn't relent in saying God loves you, God sees you, and God calls you. Do you know what I mean? God's seen your story. God will redeem your journey, and He's there. He's there, and they just did it again and again and again and again. And for me, I think that's one of our primary jobs as leaders. Wherever you're leading, whatever you're doing, whether that's in your home, whether that's as a neighbor, whether that's in your job, to see people who are made in the image of God and remind them of that, and tell them of their God-given potential, and to celebrate, not just tolerate them, but to celebrate what God is doing in their lives, and then fan it into flame in whatever way you can, and encourage it and ignite it in any way you can, so that they could live into what God's got for them. I think it's good for us all when we see that happen. So they modeled, and they spoke something over me and lived it with me, and made it very easy and inevitable that I would want to do the same.
Yeah. That's brilliant. So you come out of Cliff College, what happens next?
I moved to Sheffield. Sorry, I missed a couple of things. I had a place at Oxford University to study English, and I really wanted to go. How can I just say that? I really wanted to go, but I felt the Lord was calling me at that point. I'd come back to the Lord. He'd changed my life. He'd given me new perspective, new vision, new purpose. And I also, if I was honest, didn't feel strong enough to go to university just yet. I didn't feel like I would live the life. Do you know what I mean? I think I had to just be honest and self-aware a little of my vulnerability still. So I stayed at Bible college for another year, which was not, that didn't go well with my family. You've got to imagine an immigrant family who have worked really hard to give your kid a better life, multi-faith immigrant family, and then you're saying Jesus wants me not to go to Oxford. It's not great. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. It's just not great. And so I understand why that was real painful for my family. And not just painful, disrespectful. I'm an African. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But I moved to Sheffield and made a shed load of really good friends, many of whom I'm still very close with. And it was at a time in the 90s where God by His Spirit was moving in particular churches in particular ways. And again, for me, it didn't feel new. It felt like a reminder of the God I met when I was a kid. Mm-hmm. I thought, I recognize this. I've seen this before. I've seen the Spirit of God move like this before. And I think that was just a time for me of just being available. And I ended up working at a church in Sheffield for a number of years, with teenagers initially, and then with college students, at which point you and I met.
Right. Yeah. So they identified your talent there and put you to work, and give us some stories from lives transformed those days.
I think that, that what I loved about that era was, there was a kind of underdogness that there was in the UK and in the North, because there weren't many people going to church, but it wasn't a siege mentality. Sometimes if you feel like you're in the minority, you can feel under threat the whole time. Mm-hmm. And you look at a city where maybe at that time, I wouldn't know the stats today, but at that time only 2% were found in church on a Sunday, and you can feel really insecure, or you could see, oh my gosh, what a massive opportunity this is. Mm-hmm. What a massive opportunity. And here I am coming off these couple of transformative years, and I'm like, I want to take part of the opportunity. And so the stories would be anything from with friends praying all night to see God move and Him transforming us, and us going outside and feeding the homeless and praying with people and praying with strangers. There was a lot of praying with strangers. I do remember I do remember that. There was a lot of leading people to the Lord and never seeing Him again. Just these one of my friends used to call it doing a mad one for Jesus, where you just go out and see who was there and who was available and how you could minister to them. And the whole thing was, we have an opportunity to just share Jesus with people and see lives transformed. I remember meeting somebody, I was part of a running club, and meeting somebody, and she was really quite testy. She's really quite, and I thought, I don't quite understand why you're angry with me. All I said was hello. And then I bumped into her in the street the following day, and she talked about how she was raised Catholic, very conservative environment, and her husband had been brutally unfaithful to her, and the church had told her that she was to blame. That she said, I knew enough to know that couldn't be true, but I was completely ostracized. And I remember just standing with her, and we just talked for about an hour, and I said, you know what? I just said, I'm so sorry for what you've experienced. I'm so sorry for how misunderstood you've been. And do you know what I mean? There was just a lot of, I'm so sorry. And I said, God's heart for you is not this, because there was so much that was flung in her face, and so much, there was just so much rejection and pain. And I said, I want you to hear from me. I said, this may be really hard to believe, but God does not reject you. God has not rejected you. He sees you. And I just reminded her of Hagar in the Bible, and you are the God who sees me. I said, Hagar was swept up in circumstances that she had no control over. I said, you have been swept up in circumstances you had no control over. But God sees you and he redeems you. And she had a couple of kids, one who had significant additional needs. And I said, when you're ready, I'd love you to come to church with me one day. I said, if you're ready. I accept that this might be a journey for you, because when you've been wounded and brutally treated by church, you don't want to go into a building again. It just looks and smells like pain. But miraculously, I turn up at church that a couple of days later, and I see her in there. And she walks up to me, she goes, you didn't tell me. And she said, what is this? She goes, I walk in the room and just so much. And she couldn't have words for this. Her and her son came to faith that night, stayed ever since. I mean, it was just, and it was things like that were God's kindness of him kind of seeking out the people who the world has forgotten again and again and again. And as a church, it was growing at that time, and I was given the responsibility of working with college kids. And it was just because it was an opportunity, because there was so much opportunity, there were kids who were planting around the nightclubs and stuff. We had one community group who basically would go out and wipe up the vomit outside the clubs on a Friday and Saturday night as a way of serving the community. And that their job was to wipe up the vomit, bless people in the name of Jesus, and make sure people got home safely. And they would see the hands and feet of Jesus, because the guys would not take advantage of drunk women. They'd make sure that they were safe, things like that. And it was the doormen who came to faith first. Because the bouncers, because they were the ones who saw people do this in the name of Jesus, week in, week out, breaking up fights, cleaning up vomit, making sure that people knew they were safe and loved again and again, and doing and saying in the name of Jesus, not taking anything for it, not demanding people came to church, just telling them that God loved them, not criticizing their lifestyle, or do you know what I mean, or saying you got to behave better, not caring who you were, just saying this is how Jesus sees you. And seeing and again, there were initiatives and things like that happening left, right, and center, of just people wanting to show a city that God had not forgotten their name. And God saw them and saw their story, whether you were rich or poor, black or white, whether you had people of faith, or whether you had come from, whether you were a refugee, didn't matter. God saw you. God knew you. And God would not stop until he found you. And I remember it was wonderful. Like, we did some apologetic nights with college, with university kids. And I remember one guy saying to me, he goes, if you've never had any of this before, if you've never met, what kind of God is going to reach out to you? How do you know God's going to reach you if you haven't grown up in this stuff? And I said, all I can tell you is I didn't grow up in this stuff. And God found me. And I said, right here, right now, God's found you. And I goes, I know it seems strange and it seems weird to testify like that, but I said, on paper, I shouldn't be in here. I shouldn't be in here telling you about Jesus, but I'm telling you because I've met him and I know he's real, and he'll meet you if you want to. I can't tell you the privilege it was to have conversations like that, to talk with people, to share with people, to minister to people. I remember going into my hairdresser's one time and her saying to me, she said, okay, I got to know her over a few months, and she said, okay, we need to talk. And she said, I don't get what it is about your life. You come in, and she said, your life isn't perfect. I know your life isn't perfect, but she said, there is something different. I said, all I can tell you is it's Jesus. Yeah. And she said, well, I need you to pray. And so there were, it was your everyday. It was, there were the big events, and we planted congregations, but actually, Simon, the congregations were just one person at a time. Yeah. Stories with people, conversations with people. Throughout my 20s, for my stories, there's a million others of different people who either worked for church or who didn't work for church, but had a friend who they connected with, people who they played football with, and treated them differently on the pitch than the non-Christians did. And do you know what I mean? And like, okay, I've just said things about your mother and you didn't punch me. Why is this? Do you know what I mean? It was that stark. Yeah. But can I just tell you one more story that to this day still gets me, which makes me remember that God is at work in the world. We're joining him on what he's doing, you know? And it was just before I got married and I was getting my nails done. And the woman who was doing my nails said to me, she goes, "Do you believe in evil spirits?" And I remember thinking, God, I don't really want to do this today. Do you know what I mean? I'm just about to get married. And I was feeling particularly bridezilla in that hour. I'm like, can we just have a day off? Do you know what I mean? And she goes, "Do you believe in evil spirits?" And I'm like, oh God, please no. And I goes, "Yeah, I do." And this is someone who's not from it's not, you know, like non-Westerners often believe in evil spirits and all that kind of stuff. This is a Sheffield woman. Do you know what I mean? Multiple generations and stuff. Again, 2% of people in church on a Sunday. Why are you having conversations about evil spirits with someone? Because things are happening in her world. And then she says to me, "I think there's one in my house." And I'm like, oh no. No, I don't really want to talk about this right now. And I said, "How do you know there's something evil in your house?" And she said, "Things keep on flying off my wall. There is a cold presence. I feel like I'm being followed." I mean, it was really creepy stuff. And I said to her, I goes, "Okay." And I said, "That's terrible." And she said, "I think I'm going to pay for a priest or something to get rid of it." And I'm like, hold on a second. It's at this point, I kind of was like, okay, we need to stop thinking about our nails now, Joe. And I said, I guess, "What do you mean?" And she said, because she'd moved out of the house. Such was the fear and the agony and the weirdness in that she'd moved out and she was living with her parents. And I said, "You're telling me?" I goes, "Did you buy this house?" She said, "Yeah, it's her first home." I goes, "You're paying a mortgage." And she just looked at me. She said, "What's that?" I said, "You're paying a mortgage for evil to live in your house?" And I said, no, this cannot be. Simon, I'd love to tell you it was my heart for the city, but honestly, it was the money that annoyed me. It was the money that made me really annoyed. You know, this young woman's just starting out. She just bought a house and now she can't live in it. Just it felt so offensive. And I said, "Look, I'm a Christian. I believe in Jesus, and Jesus does not want this for you." I said, "We're going to pray. And I believe that God's going to change your situation." I said, and she got really excited. And she goes, "No one's ever prayed with me before." She goes, "What should I do?" Should I close my eyes? Goes, "If you could just finish doing my nails, that would be good. I just need you to do my nails." And she'd been asking about how Chris and I had got together and everything. And she goes, "Would you also pray that I would meet somebody?" And I thought, we're already in the weird zone. We can pray for whatever you want. You know what I mean? And so she keeps her eyes open. And I pray really simply. And I said, "Lord, you see her and you see her story. And I simply want to ask that you'd have mercy and you'd cleanse her home and that you'd bring somebody into her life." And then I go get married, completely forget about her because, and then get home and then it's like time to do the eyebrows because my eyebrows are persistent. And do you know what I mean? If I don't take action, they turn into a caterpillar and crawl off my face. So I go in. And I go in and she's like, "It's gone." And I'm touching my eyebrows thinking, I don't really know what you're talking about because they're really here. And she's like, "No, the evil spirit has gone." And I was stunned. And I said, "How do you know?" Because how do you know? She goes, "Well, things aren't flying off the wall. There is the atmosphere has changed in my house. It's a peaceful place. It's a place of peace and calm." And she said, "I don't get it." But she said, I've moved back in. She said, "And I met somebody." and a few months later, we were moving to the States. And she said to me, she goes, "I want you to know that I've not forgot that God did this." And I said, and her and her boyfriend were about to move in together. And she said, "I've said to him, at some point, we're going to have to do something about what God has done for us." And he brought us together and he's changed and he's given us a life. And at some point, we're going to have to respond to that. It's profound. It's profound.
That is. Hey folks, I hope you're enjoying the podcast. I'm loving the response we're getting from across the world. It's just wonderful to see how encouraging and inspiring it is being and hitting the spot. Listen, if you are being blessed by it, I'd love it. Basically, this happens under the auspices of our ministry, Great Lakes Outreach, which works in the poorest and the hungriest country in the world, which is Burundi. We're having an incredible impact in the toughest of circumstances. We want to carry on supporting those local folks doing a great job. So if you wanted to, greatlakesoutreach.org/inspired. you could make a donation there. I'd so appreciate it. Also, it's word of mouth, isn't it? So gossip these podcasts to other people, get them to subscribe, give us a great review. Absolutely wonderful. So grateful to you. So that's greatlakesoutreach.org/inspired. If you want to do a monthly, a couple of quid a month, or a one-off donation, we'd be incredibly grateful. All right, now let's get back to the podcast. So, hey, listen, we're sort of we need to get through a lot more material still. So, tell us about how you met Chris, and then we move into the. Did you move straight to America together?
About a year after we got married.
How did that happen?
Yeah, so we were at the same church, and it was just we were doing a ministry trip to Germany together, I think, and he was I actually liked somebody else at the time, so I was probably quite free to be myself. Do you know what I mean? I wasn't trying to impress anybody or anything. And we got together quite quickly, and just I was 29 by that point. I'm like, I'm not testing here. We're either going to get married or we're not. And about a year later, our pastor at the church at the time was beginning to sense that it was time for him to move on. And I'd always felt called to the States quite separately, actually. At some point in my teens, excuse me, at a point in my teens when I was following Jesus, I had a thing about America, and knew I'd end up living here. So about four or five families moved together, and it was like a church swap of kinds. We were going to serve at this church, and they were going to send resources over, which they did actually, to work with us, and that's how we ended up in America, and began this very, very different journey. Because honestly, it was awful at first. I mean, it was terrible. I think there was so much we didn't know, didn't understand. I mean, and it was like going from the promised land and back into the wilderness. Do you know what I mean? It was like it was a very different space, and it's not like the wilderness is a terrible space. There is the cloud by night and the fire by day. There is manna, there is water from the rock, but it was learning a very different way of living after a season, a big season of seeing like these wonderful missionary adventures and all this kind of wild excitement. It was a very different chapter of our lives.
So yeah, interesting, isn't it? Different lessons, different seasons. You've been in America, 20 odd years now, is it?
Yeah, about 18 years.
18 years. What are the key moments? Share with us your key moments.
I think in every space we've been, there has been some key moments. So even though Phoenix was really challenging, and it was relationally challenging with the team, so much of it fell apart. Completely. But I remember some of the breakthroughs that we saw in that era where it was like seeing how could the God who you saw in the kind of wild days of your 20s, is he relevant here? And seeing him move amongst young families was a really powerful thing. Praying with people in my running club. It's almost doing the same things, but God coming again and seeing his faithfulness. And then we worked in a downtown church. After the team kind of went their separate ways, as it were, we were based in an urban church in downtown Phoenix, and it was rough. But God. But again, it was that moment of desperation. But God came. One key highlight from that era is we were working with Bhutanese refugees, and it was that thing of you go out, and because again, we're like, when everything's stripped away, what do? Well, you go and look and see what the Lord is doing, and you see how you can serve him and serve people. And we were looking for people. Who can we bless? Who can we serve? And it was not the people we expected at all, but there were these wonderful Bhutanese refugees that we were working with, and we took food, and do you know what I mean? And just thought, how can I'm an immigrant from an immigrant family. I get what it's like to be in a place where people don't quite get you. Yeah. Although a very different experience to what our Bhutanese brothers and sisters were going through. And so as we connected with them, first of all, the heads of the family came. So it was about 12 men. And then the next week they brought their families, and the church kind of doubled overnight. Do you know what I mean? It was really wild. And there was one particular story, was a guy who was sick, and every time he came to church, he felt better. Literally for the hour he was in worship, he would feel better. And so he just kept on coming every week because it was the hour he felt better until he was completely healed. And we only found out about that later. We didn't even pray, do you know what I mean? but that was his testimony and his journey of meeting the Lord.
Yeah.
And just this wonderful move of God amongst this community of people who had been dislocated, and this fragile, struggling church finding their way around to learning to love in a new way and serve in a new way and revitalize them in a new way. And the mission of God was a real powerful thing. We lived in LA for a while, again, different community, very different set of people. And in that environment, which was quite dynamic and quite competitive and intense, it was a great time of recovery for us on one level because you were by the beach, but it was a group of people who were really accelerating their careers. And I remember thinking, one of the things we need to do is to remind people that Jesus is the Prince of Peace. And I remember being outside the school gates with a friend of mine who'd been part of church but been out of it for a little while, and she had this severe migraine and she was deeply grieving the loss of a parent. And I goes, can we just pray? Can we just take a moment to pray? And she's like, here? And I'm like, we'll keep our eyes open. People will just think we're just chatting. Do you know what I mean? But I said, we need to pray for you because your world has been turned upside down. And we prayed, and the Lord, in his mercy, just ripped the migraine away, completely restored, revitalized her completely, and turned her world around. And again, but God knew what she needed. I think although it's been a challenging number of years, I've seen the faithful hand of a God who's always known what people needed. Yeah. Whether they were a wealthy person in LA or whether they were a refugee who is living in the corner of Phoenix, whether they were a young family, every generation, every tribe and tongue, God is seeking them out and is inviting us to get involved.
Yeah.
Again and again. I think that would be the strongest story. Now here in Minnesota is a different stage again. We are, our kids are now teenagers. A lot of our ministry has been coming alongside them and their friends really, and being good neighbors. But again, seeing the kingdom of God come. And I think there's been a twofold thing. One, for me, on a personal level, it's been like when you run a marathon, you've got to take care of your body. You know what I mean? You've got to take care of yourself, and allowing the Lord to keep on restoring and rebuilding and refreshing vision and purpose. We've had these past few years which have reset all of us in kind of devastating ways. Is God still God? Can he still do it? Can he still move? Does he still transform when you've lived long enough to carry more scars? Kind of thing. Yeah. And to find out that he still does. Yeah. And to not be weary of well-doing. I think it's weird. There are key lessons that God teaches us in our life that I just invite us all to go back to and say, when it was clear, when the sun was shining, what did you know about the Lord? Because he's still that God in the dark.
Mm. And I guess you have a sort of a unique view of things as an African Black woman in America. Yeah. So with all the stuff, George Floyd was in your backyard. Yeah. And so you've obviously lived that up close and personal. And, how do you process that?
Simon, it's been agonizing. It's been agonizing because there were a couple of things that happened. One, obviously it's devastating to watch, and I couldn't watch, but it was devastating to know and to live. And my children are hurting and agonizing, wondering if they're safe, and wondering if we're safe. And then my friends in England being horrified and me thinking, were you there? Because I could tell you what happened in Sheffield to us who were Black people there. I could tell you what, where were you when that was happening? Don't get upset now. I didn't expect that kind of grief. But again, I think it's been a space for really honest, raw conversations with people. It's been a moment where the church has needed to be on its knees in all kinds of ways. Do you know what I mean? In terms of in prayer, but also to repent for some things, honestly, the things it's forgotten in terms of its biblical mandate. Yeah. Even of seeing human beings as made in the image of God rather than less than because they were different from you. And I think it's this once the noise has died down, because sadly the news cycle is such that we move on to another story and another life. Who will we be? What will it mean for us to be? Will we be part of rebuilding the ancient walls, or will we move on and forget? Will we be people who are living what reconciliation means, or will we call it politics and woke and sweep it aside? We can't criticize the world for doing what we forgot to do. We can't criticize them for doing imperfectly what we kind of got so wrapped up in our own mess we didn't do.
Yeah.
But now it's I'm not saying it's easy, but the kingdom of God never was. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I'm not saying it's easy. I'm not saying it's straightforward, but we are. It turns out the marathon is an ultra marathon. What do we need to do to refit ourselves for the task? Because I think again, it's another reminder. There is lots of work to be done. Lots of work to be done. Lots of bridges to be built and rebuilt. Lots of humility to adopt. And lots of getting to it. And that actually, yes, in our relationships with one another, but a lot of the systems in our world have been built by human beings, and not all of them weigh fairly on each other. I remember talking, and it's funny working out what it means to be faithful in this moment. I remember talking to the superintendent of our school when all of this stuff came up, because I said, okay, racial things are happening in our school. What are you going to do? And I challenged him about a particular thing. It wasn't a harsh conversation actually at all. He was very humble about it. And he goes, I have to be honest with you. I used to think that we gave everybody a chance, but I keep on hearing, and you're not the first parent who comes to me, a black parent saying my kid's being held back in math. And I said, look, my challenge to you is, what are we going to do about this? It's great that you're seeing it. It's great that you're sad about it. What we need to do is change it and be part of a move for change. And it's interesting to see where the Spirit of God will lead us. In this moment, I'm reminded of the Daniels and the Josephs of the Bible, who actually had jobs, guys. Do you know what I mean? I mean, they had jobs. Deborah really was a judge. Luke really was a doctor. And it was in the context of their daily work we saw the kingdom of God come. Yeah. And it's time. It's always been time, but it's time. It's time.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. I feel like even with that question, we've just opened up a whole series of podcasts, let alone, I feel 5 minutes on that just didn't do it justice, but you packed in a lot of wisdom there. Listen, there's loads more that we could talk about. I don't want you to miss out anything that you want to say in terms of, I am interested in how you've gone to a certain level of profile now in the States through your podcasts. You're speaking at loads of conferences. How do you manage that with family, keeping humble? All this. I mean, stuff. Yeah. I travel a lot. I speak at a lot of things. It's easy. Are you really rooted in community? That sort of question. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I have had to be really, there are a number of practices that are important to me. So 3 mornings a week, 5:30 a.m., me and a friend pray. And we pray that early because we just both happen to be morning people. It could be any time of day, obviously, but that's our time. And that has been it actually began out of crisis when we were having some challenges with the church we were part of here about 10 years ago. That has been the mainstay. Things have our jobs have changed, opportunities have changed. That prayer life is on. That stays.
Brilliant.
That has rooted me and grounded me more than I know. To keep bathing my life in prayer and bringing my work, my thoughts, my life, my family to the throne room again and again and again, is key. I think I've learned that, there are seasons for things. So the profile thing, I think it's hard. I honestly think the profile thing is particularly hard. I'd be interested in your thoughts on this in the States, because there is in some ways something of a Christian industry.
Yeah.
And so it has been important for me to walk away from time to time. You know what I mean? To not do things, to say my no's. There's a bit like I said, I grew up in the Methodist church, and there's a Methodist covenant prayer that would be prayed every year. And it's let me be employed for you or laid aside for you, exalted for you or brought low for you. And that is the prayer of my heart when I look at these things, to say, in this season, do you want me to do it or do you not? Because otherwise you get owned by this stuff.
Absolutely.
And owned by the message, and because it's an anxious environment, and you get owned by making you think it's about saying what you're about what God's doing, but actually it's you having to do these things, and it can be quite addictive if you're not careful, and addicted to the work rather than devoted to the Lord. They're not the same thing. You know what I mean? They're not the same thing, and so I've had to make sure. Am I praying? Have I got people I can talk to? Is there real, genuine accountability in my life? not fake accountability,
Yeah.
genuine accountability in my life. And we picked up scars on the way in the journey. So there have been times when I've needed to go and talk to a therapist and process stuff out, because what I don't want is the garbage to be all over my house, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
So those things have been really important, and to not assume, my dreams aren't my rights. That those things have helped me stay sensible. The other thing has been really helpful for me is to just keep on giving things away. So, there may be an opportunity that comes up, and I could do it, but I'm not the best person for it. Who can I recommend? Who is God raising up? Who is not known that needs this opportunity? Again, going back to those leaders who started with me, and who gave me opportunities that I'm not sure I was ready for, but they saw something. And that is just a really great way of it not always becoming about you.
Yeah.
Because you're busy looking for other people and elevating other voices and saying, hey, church, we need to hear from her. Hey, church, we need to hear from him. Hey, church, we need to hear what that person's doing, because what God is doing there is something that we all need to learn from. And making that not just a nice sentiment, but a living practice in my life. I can look at my week and see time when I'm telling an organization about another person that God is moving on has become a really important practice for me.
Yeah. Hey, there's so much gold in that. I think back to, our paths overlapped several times when we went to the States, 2010, 11, 12.
Yeah.
And we moved from Burundi to America. And the idea in my mind was, instead of raising £1 million, why not raise 10 million quid? Instead of selling 50,000 books, why not 500,000 books? And it wasn't about me, but it was about kingdom impact in Burundi. Yeah. So just wanting to get more dosh back to Burundi and stuff. And what was fascinating, well, the way the Lord spoke to me through it is, at the end of those 2 years, I desperately did not want to stay in America. I loved it. Yeah. I loved our community, but I thought my heart is, I feel like I'm just dying. I said to Lizzie, my wife, I said, my heart's dying here. So it just wasn't for us. Yeah. But I came across this Phil Vischer of VeggieTales.
I love Phil.
So his story, basically going from hero to zero, from multimillionaire to being sued by one of his distributors and losing everything. And he said two things in it which completely nailed me. The first one was that sometimes when God gives you a dream, he lets the dream die to see whether you love him more than the dream or not. Yeah. Now, I think that can speak to everyone. But the second thing, which absolutely nailed me, was this. The impact God wants you to have for him does not come when you pursue impact. It comes when you pursue him.
Yeah. Yeah.
And my realization was that I had gone to America, and I was very aware of the danger of the sort of celebrities type stuff, the Christian subculture. But I didn't want that, but I did want impact for him. And he just said, "Look, no, just pursue me." Yeah. And I think that was a word that just has always stayed with me. Yeah. And I think the older you get, I mean, there's always the flesh, isn't there? And when you're on the stage and that sort of thing. But just pursue me. Seek first. Matthew 6:33. Yeah.
Oh God.
And I'll be cheering you on to do that all the way, dear sister.
Thank you. Thank you.
Listen, last chance. Say whatever you want to say. A couple of minutes, go.
Yeah, I think I want to say to this faithful community, it has been a brutal few years, and it has challenged us, but God is still moving and God is still here. And I want to invite you to do two things. I want to invite you to invite God by his Spirit to meet you in the broken pieces. And to meet you in the broken pieces of your story, the losses, maybe where disappointment is leading your vision rather than you, where despair or fear is leading your vision more than you. I want to invite you, like the Bible says, hope deferred makes the heart sick. Maybe some of us are experiencing some significant heart sickness because we're living a life or in a space that we didn't expect. And we know we didn't expect faith to be easy, but this is kind of raw. And I just want to invite you to invite the Spirit of God to come and meet you there, and to show you what the next step in is that. But I want to also invite you to remember we have a twofold purpose as people who know the Lord, to know him intimately, but also to represent and reflect him in the world. Because God has always called his people in times of crisis. Look at Moses, look at Joseph, look at Daniel. Do you know what I mean? Look at Esther, look at Deborah. Look at the early church, times of deep upheaval and turbulence, incredible uncertainty, incredible loss. God was calling his people, and I believe he's doing it again. He's calling us. And so I want to invite you, yes, to get that the stuff you need to kind of heal up and get restored and rebuild, do the work, rebuild the relationships, yes. But also in this moment, ask the Lord, what are you doing in the world and where do you want me to join you? It might be at work in a new way. It might be in your neighborhood. It might be crossing the street and taking your neighbor a cake. It might be how you welcome your kids home from school. I don't want to be prescriptive on what it is, but God is moving and he's calling his people to rise with him. And I want to invite each of us to ask him how we can join him in what he's doing, because he is still about the renewal of all things. He is still making all things new, and we still get to be involved in that.
Amen. Joe, how can people be in touch with you? What do you want to plug?
I think you can go, my website, joesaxton.com, shows you books and websites and podcasts. I do a lot in terms of coaching women leaders. So if that's something for you or people you know, feel free to go on the website and see what's there. I would enjoy everybody's prayers. Do you know what I mean? My prayer is that I'm faithful to what he invites me into in this chapter of my life. So those will be the things. But joesaxton.com will show you the different things that you can find out more about.
Excellent. Thanks, sister. God bless you loads.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Hey, guys, I trust you've been inspired. It's been another brilliant time together. If you have, please give us a great review on iTunes or Spotify, and share this podcast. I mean, what Joe's spoken about will have nailed so many different people and areas of life that, people need to hear this stuff, don't they? So do pass it on. If you want to be in touch with me, it's simongilbert.com, any of the social media platforms. I want to thank Adam Thomas Steer for the editing and Mike Sandeman for the mixing. And next week we're back with another great guest. So join us again. And in the meantime, have a great week. All right, toodaloo.